Welcome to Chautauqua Books. The book being reviewed is Super Imperialism, The Origin and Fundamentals of U.S. World Dominance by Michael Hudson. The reviewer is David Leitch.
It's a system where essentially the U.S. gets a free ride, and countries like China, Japan, and even all the OPEC countries that are selling the U.S. all this oil, all those surplus dollars come back into the U.S. economy through the purchase of Treasury bills, and the U.S. uses them to finance war and its budget deficits. When this author, Michael Hudson, actually wrote this book in 1972, and he explained what was going to happen as the result of the elimination of the gold standard. And he said when he explained to people in the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve, if you eliminate the gold standard, you take any restrictions or you completely take the brakes off any kind of surpluses, either financial or in trade. There's no way you don't have this claim on your gold reserves to keep your balance of payments in line. And he said that he thought people in the Treasury and the Federal Reserve within the U.S. government would say, oh, yes, we can't do that. But he said instead, they said, oh, yes? And the lights went on, and they realized that they could then achieve dominance through debt rather than through being a creditor, because they were quickly becoming a debtor nation. The U.S. didn't officially become one until 1986, but they were well on the way. They were running huge dollar surpluses, and there were trade deficits. So they realized, yes, this is we can control it we can control the global economy and the global order by being a debtor. And he actually says they're not trying to extract themselves from this. And when we say they, we must always remember this is a ruling elite in any country, be that United States, Canada, the Soviet Union, China. I mean, they're tied into this system where he says, since you no longer have a gold standard, you have a treasury bill standard. And by that I mean you have the national central banks of, let's take the two most obvious countries now, Japan and China. They have huge U.S. currency reserves that their businesses and industries have earned by their trade surpluses with the United States, by selling far more goods to the United States than the United States is selling to them. So they have these huge dollar surpluses, and they're in these national central banks. And essentially, the only thing these countries can do, since they can no longer reclaim this money in gold, they reclaim it by buying U.S. Treasury bills. And the next logical question is, what's the result of that? The result is that the U.S. takes all this money that is invested in U.S. Treasury bills and uses it to finance our own budget deficits. And as in the case of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, to finance our wars, to finance all our military spending. He does look at central banking, but he looks at it as a worldwide phenomenon. So he's saying that what you have with this intergovernmental debt is you have this relationship between the central banks all over the world, including, of course, the U.S. Federal Reserve, so that the debt, ultimately, the debt that these countries owe, it's all dealt with through this sort of this worldwide central bank network. And and to a certain extent, the central banks are all associated with and working through the IMF and the World Bank. So it is, central banking is very important to his thesis. And he's showing that importance, the importance that the debt, both from the First World War, when the U.S. was the world's major creditor, and then after the Second World War, when the U.S. still remained the world's dominant creditor, up to really, 1971 through 73, in which the U.S. starts to slip into the world's largest debtor nation. But it's all worked through these central banks. Hudson says Americans are under the illusion that, foreign aid is an act of generosity, and we're actually losing money. We're actually just giving this money away gratis to foreign countries that are in need. Well, he says far from it. It is a money maker, and it is a means to dominate a lot of countries, particularly poor countries. And one of the things he points out is that during the Second World War, most of the countries, particularly in Latin America, and even in Africa, attained food self-sufficiency because they had to. Any U.S. surpluses were essentially being absorbed by the war effort, not only providing for the U.S. population, but for the populations of U.S. allies. So after the Second World War, the U.S. more or less used food aid as a means to undermine that food self-sufficiency that so many third world or developing countries had attained during the Second World War. And this gave them this gave the U.S. a very dominant position, because, as Hudson points out, the basis of developing any kind of a mature industrial economy is a solid agricultural base. Well, if you're undermining these Latin American, Asian, and African countries' food self-sufficiency, you're also undermining their economic development, industrially, financially, and in every other aspect. So you're using foreign aid to make them not only dependent on you for food, but dependent on you for industrial production. It's a very effective colonial weapon, absolutely.
The book being reviewed is Super Imperialism: The Origin and Fundamentals of U.S. World Dominance by Michael Hudson.